Welcome to the Silicon Valley Health Institute. We are a nonprofit where our goal is to get high quality health information out to the public. And nowadays, I feel that's more important than ever. All of our previous videos and Zoom meetings are on our website, which I posted in the chat, www.svhi, as in Silicon Valley Health Institute. So my co-host here is Steve Fowkes. I'm Susan Downs, and they were in a baseball cap. We've got Sarah. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you, Stephen.
Let me tell you a little bit about Sarah. I mean, she's incredible. Those on the other side of the pond know of her well, but for this folks on this side of the pond, she's qualified in medicine with honors from Middlesex Hospital in 1981, and since focused tirelessly on identifying and treating the underlying cause of health problems, especially the diseases of civilization, which are beset in. She's worked for the NHS, that's the National Health Service, and in private practice, and was the honorary secretary for the British Society of Ecological Medicine, renamed from the British Society for Allergy, Environmental, and Nutritional Medicine. This is a medical society interested in looking at causes of disease and treating through diet, vitamins, minerals, and through avoiding toxic stresses. She helps and runs lectures at the Society's training courses and also lectures regularly on organophosphate poisoning, the problems of silicone, chronic fatigue syndrome, infections, toxins, many other topics, and has made many appearances on radio. So welcome.
Thank you, Susan.
I think the question that I'd like to start with, which I think is on most people's minds, has to do with this issue of coronavirus mortality and the pre-existing conditions that put people at risk that up until this point have been kind of like, below the level of the ocean and the iceberg where, people don't know that it's there. And now all these pre-existing conditions are becoming very painfully obvious, and everybody's now paying attention when they haven't before. Please comment on that and where you think this might lead to, in the near future.
Well, we have learned so much about COVID-19 over the past 3 or 4 months, and the data on the relevant interventions has been pouring in. One thing I've been listening out for all the time on the radio and in the papers and on the television is for that word, the immune system. And guess what? We never hear it. Because the whole key to defeating COVID-19 is to improve our immune defenses. We are constantly being assailed by bacteria, fungi, viruses, all sorts of nasty pathogens. And what keeps them at bay is a good immune system. And with COVID-19, nothing is different. And I now know, without a shadow of doubt, from what I've learned from the literature review, that if we put in place these 4 pillars that I'm going to talk about, we no longer need fear COVID-19, and we could cancel all these ridiculous, shutdowns and antisocial restrictions that are being put on, and forget the vaccinations. Okay, so there are 4, and I'm a great fan of what I call the KISS principle. Keep it simple, sweetheart. And people ask me, oh, what about quercetin? Or what about ACE inhibitors and all that? I say, don't worry about those things. If you follow these 4 pillars well, you need not fear COVID-19, and neither need your family. And I'll try and illustrate each point as we go along. Now, the first point is, we know that people who are eating high sugar and carbohydrate diets are immunosuppressed, and the high blood sugar invites the infections in. Now, let me illustrate that with a little story. I run a mentoring group of doctors, and one of those doctors is working in an NHS hospital on the front line. And he says through their hands, they have so far had 38 cases of COVID-19, people who are seriously ill, sufficiently seriously ill to merit hospital treatment. All 38 of them had a BMI above 30, i.e. they were all overweight. They had 8 patients who died, and they all had a BMI above 34, i.e. they were very overweight. Now, what puts weight on you? Sugars and carbohydrates. All these patients had metabolic syndrome. Many of them would have been diabetic, and my guess is some of them were pre-diabetic in addition. So the first thing you need to do before you do anything else, and you do that now, don't wait to get COVID-19, put it in place now. Do a ketogenic diet, and even better, do a paleo ketogenic diet, i.e. also cut out dairy products and grains. So that's the most important thing. The second plank of this is to make sure you've got good vitamin D status. Now, this was flagged up very early on within the NHS because early on in the epidemic, we had a whole tranche of doctors and nurses who died, and there were a very high proportion of Black and Asian doctors amongst those. Now, if you have got a dark skin, you cannot make vitamin D efficiently from sunshine. And we know people who are Black and Asian have lower levels of vitamin D than their white Caucasian population. Again, another study has come out recently, again, doctor working on the front line, who measured vitamin D levels in all his patients and looked at their outcomes from COVID-19. And what was so fascinating is they had a vitamin D level of 17 nanograms per mil or less. The mortality from COVID-19 was 100%. If they had a vitamin D level of 34 nanograms per mil, I beg your pardon, 24 nanograms per mil, the mortality rate started to fall. And if they had a vitamin D level of 37 nanograms per mil, the mortality was 0. So there was a straight line relationship between vitamin D levels and mortality from COVID. So guess what? Get your vitamin D up. How much vitamin D do you need to take? Well, my view is the minimum is 5,000 international units daily. I recommend my patients take 10,000 international units daily, and up to that daily dose, there has never been any complication, any serious side effect of vitamin D. So that's a very safe dose to take. And think about that in terms of sunshine. That is equivalent to about an hour of sunbathing. So guess what? Primitive man would have been running around naked under the African sun for 12 hours a day. So he had even higher levels of vitamin D. So it just illustrates the point how safe vitamin D is. So trot out, get yourself some vitamin D, at least 5, ideally 10,000 IU daily. It's very cheap vitamin D. The third thing you have to do is vitamin C. Now, I could talk all day about vitamin C. It's one of my favorite subjects. But vitamin C has a double whammy effect in COVID-19. First of all, it contacts kills all microbes directly. So it's a very good antiviral. The second thing is it protects you from the pro-oxidant stress of the cytokine storm when COVID-19 gets serious. 2 studies have been produced since the outbreak of this epidemic, one in Wuhan, one in New York. On both occasions, they used 10 grams of vitamin C intravenously over 24 hours. Now, 10 grams is not a big dose. It sounds a lot, but believe you me, it is not. The more serious patients, they gave 20 grams intravenously over 24 hours. So what was the mortality from these 2 studies, which each involved 50 patients? The mortality was 0. The cost of 24 hours of 10 grams of vitamin C is $12. The cost of 24 hours of intravenous 20 grams of vitamin C is $24. So this is a very cheap, highly effective treatment. But guess what? It does not make money for big pharma. This is not a treatment that is going to be pushed by the powers that be. Now you can achieve very similar, if not as good as, blood levels of vitamin C by taking it by mouth. And my view is you should be taking at least 5 grams over the 24 hours. How do you do that? You get yourself a glass of water, you put 5 grams of vitamin C. Now that is 5,000 milligrams of vitamin C dissolved in the water, slurp it through the day. So by the end of the day, that is gone. So little and often, and that will maximize the levels of vitamin C in your tissues. So those 3 things will put you in the starting blocks. So the chances of getting any problem with COVID-19 become diminishingly small. And then there's a 4th intervention which I'm recommending. Again, it was very obvious early on that those patients who were getting severe effects from COVID-19 were working on the front line. They were working with COVID-19 patients. They were getting a very large loading dose. Now, if you gave that a fit and healthy person a large enough loading dose of any virus, they would succumb to it. Why? Because the immune system takes time to gear up its response. And if you get a large loading dose, the numbers of microbes will build up faster than the immune system can deal with it. So the 4th intervention is keep the loading dose of virus down. Now, we pick up COVID-19 in two ways. We pick it up by direct contact. So what I ask my patients to do, and this is a very cheap intervention, get yourself a pot of coconut oil and some Lugol's iodine, and make up a mix which is 10 parts of coconut oil to 1 part of Lugol's iodine. And I use 15% Lugol's iodine. So if you get a weaker solution, then you need a little bit more Lugol's. And mix it up. So if you melt the coconut oil, it melts in a warm room. Mix in the coconut oil, push it, and then leave that pot by your back door. And then for any foreign contact, you take about a marble-sized amount of coconut oil, rub it into your hands, rub it onto your forearms, onto your face. Both coconut oil and iodine individually kill COVID-19 in a few seconds. Actually, iodine kills all microbes within a few seconds. And that's why the surgeons love to use iodine. So if you've ever had any surgery, what do? You wake up with a big, yellow patch on you, because that's iodine. And the joy of iodine is that it is volatile. So you will inhale some of that and it'll spread under the skin as well. But the point about that is every time you touch something, a door handle, steering wheel in your car, you're going to sterilize that too. So you massively reduce the loading dose of COVID-19 from direct contact. And then the other way you can get COVID-19 is through inhaling it. And this is where an iodine salt pipe is fantastically useful. Now, a salt pipe, anybody can get them online, or you can make them yourself. It's simply a plastic pot with holes in the bottom that's filled with sea salt. And what I recommend my patients do during the epidemic is once or twice a day, put a couple of drops of Lugol's iodine into the mouthpiece, like that. Oh, I spilled some on the outside, never mind. Give it a shake, and then sniff it. So hold it to the nose and sniff that, several times. Now, the point is, if you can smell the iodine, you have got a therapeutic dose. That will contact kill any microbes in the nose, the sinuses, and the airways and the lungs. Now, I've already put this to the test on 4 of my patients who have bronchiectasis. Now, bronchiectasis is a nasty, chronic lung infection. The microbes are always there in the lungs. You never get rid of them. And if the immune system goes down, the microbes flourish. You get an acute chest infection in its antibiotics. And then you get over that one, okay, for a bit, another chest infection, more antibiotics, and eventually those patients end up with a multi-resistant microbe for which the antibiotics don't work. And then it's lung abscess, surgery, downhill, serious disease. Now, all those 4 patients have been doing these regimes, those 4 pillars, the PK DART, vitamin C, vitamin D, and the iodine inhalation. Since when their requirement for antibiotics has dropped to 0. The only time they've needed antibiotics is if they've fallen off the wagon. And guess what? I'm no paragon of virtue. We all fall off the wagon occasionally. But if they fall off the wagon, it's a serious effect. A chest infection comes straight back again. So, of course, they're very motivated now to stay on the wagon and stay well. So I'm sure you will all come at me with lots of questions, because I've done these interviews before, and this is what happens. Oh, what about this drug? What about that drug? What about chloroquine? Those interventions, those other interventions, pale into insignificance compared with these 4 pillars. So get them in place. You will stay well. Your family will stay well. And I have to say, if we all did this, as a community, as a nation, lockdown would become a thing of the past. It would become irrelevant. So get your lives back with these 4 easy interventions.
In terms of the approaching it from a preventive point of view, and building on these 4 pillars, and on a therapeutic point of view, is there a backup plan or an extension of the 4 pillars when people are actively in an infection?
Yes. When you're actively in infection, of course, you carry on with the PK DART. Vitamin D stays the same because you've already loaded up with that. But there are 2 things you do. First of all, you take vitamin C to bowel tolerance. And the key here is if you're getting any symptoms, and of course, early on, you don't know what the microbe is. It might not be COVID-19. It might be influenza. It might be a rhinovirus. It might be a mycoplasma pneumonia. But in the early stages of any infection, you take vitamin C to bowel tolerance. And what I like people to do is they take 10 grams, in water every hour until they get diarrhea. Now, you might say, oh, crumbs, that's a bit drastic. But the key with any acute infection is you hit it hard and you hit it early. And if you build up your dose of vitamin C too slowly to see, am I going to get the bowel tolerance or not, you're not getting it up sufficiently in the body to be effective, because the body will take whatever vitamin C it requires to deal with that infection. And what you will find is that your bowel tolerance dose of vitamin C increases dramatically with any infection. Now, I've seen young people, for example, with glandular fever, or mono, as you call it, acute Epstein-Barr. They don't get to bowel tolerance until they're taking maybe 200 or 300 grams of vitamin C over those 24 hours. And then as soon as the body gets ahead of the game and starts to kill the virus, that bowel tolerance dose reduces quite rapidly. But the bowel tolerance dose is a very useful measure of how sick you are and how high your infectious load is. So don't be put off by taking big doses of vitamin C. One of my favorite quotes is Fred Klenner, Dr. Fred Klenner, who used vitamin C for decades. And one of his quotes was, we should all be taking large doses of vitamin C for any pathology whilst the physician ponders the diagnosis. So, don't wait for fancy blood tests. Don't, waste time, thinking, shall I, shan't I? Just go ahead and do it. What's the worst thing that can happen? Well, you get diarrhea. So what? You empty your gut once, you clear all the virus out of the gut, and then you adjust the dose according to that. So, learn to use vitamin C well, and it's a fantastically useful tool in any acute pathology. And again, with the iodine salt pipe, what I recommend, a good 10 or 15 sniffs every 2 or 3 hours, because as the virus builds up in the lungs, it will contact kill all virus. And not only will it reduce your viral load, but it means you won't be excreting so much virus, which may infect other people. So it's a very useful community effort. Now, some of my patients have been a bit too enthusiastic with the vitamin C and said, oh, it gives me a burning sensation. You don't need that. If you can smell the iodine, you're getting a therapeutic dose. So just enough to give a good smell, good few sniffs. You coat the sinuses. In fact, what's also quite useful, and some of my patients find this helpful, is they sniff it and then they do Valsalva maneuver. So pitch the nose, blow, pop the ears, and it pushes a little bit of iodine into the eustachian tube and into the middle ear, and further helps kill COVID-19 there. But I say, this is good for any infection. It doesn't matter if you've got cough, cold, influenza, whatever, it's the treatment. Does that make sense, Stephen?
Totally. Your 4 pillars are on the top of my list as well.
And I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said, if you fail to prepare, prepare to fail. So get stocked up now, get on the PK diet now. Make sure you've got a bag of ascorbic acid in your cupboard. Make sure, which costs, I sell it in kilogram bags. It's very cheap. Make sure you've got some Lugol's iodine. Again, very cheap. I think a bottle of iodine is about 7 quid. Make sure you get some coconut oil. You can get that from your supermarket. So, these very simple, cheap interventions, work really well. And the important thing to remember here is you will not hear about this from Big Pharma. Why? Follow the money. The last thing the pharmaceutical industries want is effective, cheap treatments with no side effects that we can all use, because that does away with all their cough cures and their non-steroidal anti-inflammatories and their steroids and all the fancy drugs that they love to use and make money out. So, work it out yourself.
Yeah, one of the techniques that I've done whenever I have a bug on board is to hang a piece of paper towel from my lampshade next to my bed and drip iodine into it before I go to sleep at night, so that I'm breathing iodine all night and I don't have to think about it. Perfect.
And for children who don't tolerate the iodine salt pipe or won't use it, then if you just put the iodine oil, the coconut iodine mix, if you just smear it around their nose and face, iodine is volatile. They will get a lovely dose of iodine just from that. So if they can smell it, then they are protected. So that's a great tip. Thank you. Oh, and another tip that I tell my patients, if they feel they're obliged to use face masks, and the fascinating thing about face masks is we have no evidence to show that they're effective. They just seem like a good idea. But what would greatly enhance their efficacy is put a couple of drops of Lugol's iodine on the face mask, and then you will be inhaling iodine, and then that will make it, so much more efficacious with a little bit of iodine in place.
Why are doctors down on things that they're not up on?
Oh, it's the old story, follow the money. It's very, very simple. Education in this country, or rather medical education in this country, is bankrolled by the pharmaceutical companies. If you want to be, a hospital consultant or get a professorial chair, you have to churn out some sort of research. And the only guys who got money for research are the drug companies. So guess what? All the research is drug company based. So, it's a very simple answer to that, follow the money. And the key point, a key difference between nutritional supplements and drugs, which I'm always making to my patients, is that the joy of nutritional supplements is they facilitate the body's own biochemistry. They allow enzyme processes, immune processes, biochemical process in the bodies to flow. They allow them to happen more easily. They reduce the biochemical friction, and they reduce the immunological friction in the body. By contrast, all drugs work by inhibition. They block enzyme systems here. They're anti-hypertensive, they're anti this, they're anti-cholesterol, they're anti-something else. So they work by inhibiting. Now, of course, the idea of a drug is to inhibit just this enzyme system or just that one. But the fact of the matter is they all have side effects. They all interfere with multiple enzyme systems. And as I call it, they increase the biochemical friction. They increase the immunological friction. And it's like throwing a handful of sand into a finely tuned engine. It's not a good idea. And the more handfuls of sand you throw in and the more different handfuls of sand you throw in, the worse it gets. So, of course, you throw one drug in and you get a side effect. And then another drug comes and you get another side effect. And on it goes. And so often, in medical practice, I see older people especially who are on cocktails of drugs, of this, that, and the other. And no wonder their health goes downhill, and no wonder they deteriorate, and no wonder they're not functioning as normal individuals.
Can you talk a little bit about your personal journey after going through medical school? Did you have some kind of a formative experience that diverted you from the mainstream approach?
Well, as some of you guys know, I did 20 years in NHS health service. And it became very clear from my very early days, because, I went in having got this great qualification thinking, well, I know it all and this is going to be ever so easy. And the first few years of my medical life, honestly, they must have looked at this 23-year-old kid and thought, who is she? What do you think she's doing? Because my patients, they came to me, okay, they maybe had high blood pressure or migraine or irritable bowel or whatever. And they used to say to me, why have I got these symptoms? And I thought, well, do you know what? I haven't got a clue why they've got this. And my usual, answer was, well, let's do some blood tests and come back next week and we'll talk about that. And in the interim, I go scrabbling back to my medical textbook and thumb anxiously through the pages to see if I could find some answers. And of course, the answers weren't there. Nobody in medical education looks for causation. And of course, I now know that so much causation is the same. It's modern Western diets with high sugar, carbohydrate content, and high allergen content. But I didn't know that then. But thankfully, I had some very forgiving patients, some very lovely patients who didn't mind that I didn't know, but were happy that I was prepared to go on a journey with them. And I started off with allergy because I myself was allergic. And through my patients and experimentation, I found I was dairy allergic, my asthma disappeared, my sinusitis disappeared, my daughter's terrible colic, because I was breastfeeding at the time, disappeared. And all those issues about dairy allergy are nowhere to be found in the medical textbooks. The ENT surgeons, it's just not part of their workup. And then I found many patients were gluten sensitive, many of the irritable bowels and the migraines, cleared up with gluten-free diets. And I went on from there. So I started off with allergy, and then I discovered, those people who are allergic, they often had a fermenting gut. If you had a fermenting gut, you malabsorb micronutrients. And so my journey started from there. And 20 years on, when I was treating many of my patients with diets, with nutritional supplements, with detox regimes. I then got into the trouble with the powers that be who oversee general practice because my prescribing budget was so low. Oh, they said, she's not spending enough money on drugs. She must be a bad doctor. So I got my wrist slapped for that. So my abilities as a doctor were determined by my prescribing budget. And then it came to the point where they said, oh, to stay in general practice, you've got to have hepatitis B vaccination. Well, by then I knew so many of my ME patients, their condition had been vaccination triggered. Hepatitis B stood out. These days, the number one nasty is probably Cervarix and Gardasil, you know, the vaccines that the kids are treating to prevent HPV infections. And I thought to myself, you know what, and on top of that, I didn't have the clinical freedoms to do the tests that I wanted to do. So, for example, there were some patients who were coming to me who needed tests that the NHS could not supply. And I made arrangements for them to have these necessary tests at private laboratories. Now, I received no remuneration for that. The patients paid the laboratories directly and they came to me and I interpreted them. But that was considered to be, you know, undermining doctors' reputations. And so I started to get my wrist slapped for that. So culmination of all those things, I had to get out of NHS medicine. I went into independent medical practice, which meant I know at least I had the clinical freedoms to practice what I considered to be good medicine. And at that time in 2000, I thought to myself, I should be making all this knowledge available to everybody so anybody can help themselves to it. And with a lovely IT whiz kid called Terry, he built me a website, and that went live in 2001. So everything I learned, I put on that website, so it's freely available for all to have. And that's when my problems with the General Medical Council began. So I've now had 20 years of persecution from the General Medical Council. I'm now on investigation or prosecution number 31. The present score is MyHill 30, GMC nil, with 1 score outstanding. So I'm presently doing a battle with them. But these investigations have arisen not because through any patient. No patient has ever complained about my practice. Every single investigation has either come from other GPs, health authorities, the General Dental Council, the General Medical Council, consultants who didn't understand and didn't like what I was doing. As I say, I've kicked every single one of those into touch. In fact, one of the things I do, which is very helpful in my battles, is I do Freedom of Information Act searches of the GMC. And one came back detailing the legal advice to the GMC from an independent barrister, or lawyer as you call them. And he said, the problem with the MyHill cases, the problem is that all the patients are getting better and none of them will give a witness statement against her. Now you would think that, you know, any problem with me would start with me doing damage to a patient, but not so. And of course, Andrew Wakefield was subject to the same ridiculous investigations, and he was unfortunate. He was told by his legal team, you've got no problem here. The GMC have got nothing on you. You've done everything right. But they still managed to make trouble for him and he got struck off. But now, thankfully, he's doing great works in America, highlighting the issues and the problems of vaccinations. So that's my story. I now feel free to give the opinions that I think. I'm naturally gobby. If I think something, I'm quite happy to say it in public. And if the GMC come after me, okay, well, I will go on fighting them over that. And so far, they've yet to knock me off my perch. But even if they do, I should go on being gobby.
How much support are you getting among medical professionals behind the scenes?
Okay, well, I have, I'm part of the society, the British Society for Ecological Medicine. I'm on the committee and I help run many of their events. And privately, behind the scenes, they're all right behind me. They are completely supportive. But I don't care if I get struck off. You know, I'm financially independent, my girls are independent, it doesn't matter. But many of those are young doctors. They are reliant on the NHS for their employment. They're reliant on a regular income through NHS work for their financial security. And they dare not stick their head above the parapet because they're terrified of being prosecuted by the GMC. If they get struck off, they haven't been in medicine maybe for long enough to work independently. So lots of people behind me, but very few of them prepared to, as they put their head above the parapet and be shot at by the powers that be, because being shot at they will be. And many of my colleagues, people like Dr. Gordon Skinner, Hugh, well, I can't remember all the names, but many other doctors have been similarly persecuted and gone into a terrible decline. And many doctors investigated by the GMC, they commit suicide, or they get depressive illnesses, or they have to take early retirement because they can't take the strain of it.
Whereas you seem to enjoy it.
Well, I've got nothing to lose. Thankfully, I'm now financially independent. I have a sufficient reputation that I could continue to work as a nutritional therapist. I think it's important that I share my views with like-minded people and say exactly what I think. And do I worry about my professional reputation? No, I don't care about it anymore. The people who know me, my patients, my family, know that I'm a good person, and that's all that matters to me.
Mm-hmm. How about your the spill off of all of this and your reputation with, let's say, the public? Is there a shift in consciousness that's taking place with all of this publicity?
Well, the last 40 years, I've done my best to help other doctors and train them. But I now know that what's got to happen is a grassroots revolution. This is not change that's going to come from the top, because the top is controlled by big pharma and the establishment and people who are in power. So this is why these days I'm very happy to do any podcasts. I'm very happy to do workshops like this. In fact, I run my own workshops nowadays, where I have up to 20 people at a time, and I sit and chat to them as we are talking now. And I talk all day from 9:30 in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they can come at me with any questions and pick up their problems. And we've had really interesting and good days. And the idea of these workshops is I now know enough to give people, as I call it, the rules of the game and the tools of the trade so they can heal themselves. And increasingly, I'm moving away from from the use of drugs primarily onto nutritional supplements, diets, herbal regimes, detox regimes, and light therapy, and so on. It's very rare that I prescribe drugs these days. Sometimes antibiotics are useful, antifungals are useful, antivirals are useful. But most people can get well doing the basic things well. And as I say, it all starts with the wretched diet. And often I open my workshops saying, look, guys, I think today you're going to get a shopping list of things that you could do or you could try. But don't cherry pick them. Do the PK diet first. And if you do nothing more than that, if you do nothing more than put that in place, you will make great strides. Because getting well is like building a house. And the PK diet is the foundation stones of that house. And there's no point spending lots of money on fancy sash windows and beautiful chimneys and waterproof roofs if there's no foundation stone, because the whole thing's just going to collapse around. So start with a PK diet, sort out the fermenting gut, get on a good package of supplements for basic health and for mitochondrial function, and then fine tune the orchestra, as I call it, by sorting out the adrenal and the thyroid function. And that deals with the energy delivery mechanisms. And then I look at those patients and those people who have poor energy delivery mechanisms have the clinical picture of chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, if they also have inflammation symptoms, and inflammation is characterized by what? The pathological 5: heat, redness, swelling, pain, and loss of function. If you've got those 5 issues, you've got inflammation. And then we have to look at the inflammatory causes. And if you've got poor energy delivery mechanisms and inflammation, that's called ME. So although we tend to use those terms, chronic fatigue syndrome and ME, interchangeably, they're actually 2 different things. And the approach to them should, the roadmap, as I call it, is different. But those people who are inflamed, they're inflamed either because they have allergy or autoimmunity, which is what I call a useless inflammation, or they have problems because they've got a chronic infection, and they might be trying to fight that infection. And the top 4 microbes that come up time and time again are Epstein-Barr virus, Lyme disease, and mycoplasma, the 2 bacteria, and chronic fungal infection. They are the top 4. So even if you didn't have access to the expensive tests to diagnose those things, based on your history and the symptoms, you can have a pretty damn good guess at what's going on, and then put in place the various interventions. And all these interventions, the groundhog regimes, as I call them, are in the book, The Infection Game. So again, jumping sideways, because I mentioned the word groundhog without explaining to you what that means. It's a term that I came to adopt as I was writing the book, The Infection Game, because it became very clear to me that there are three basic packages that we have to put in place in any clinical situation. So we have what I call groundhog basic. Now, that is what we should all be doing all the time before we get any disease at all, before we get any pathology, just to stay well. And guess what? It's the paleo ketogenic diet. It's a basic package of supplements because, even with an organic diet, our food will be deficient. It will be deficient in minerals. It will be deficient in vitamins. It will be deficient in essential fatty acids. So we should all be taking, say, a basic package of supplements. We should all be taking vitamin C, as explained, 5 grams a day. Vitamin D, as explained, 10,000 IU daily. So just some basic things just to stay well. The right balance of exercise, of sleep, and so on. And then we have groundhog acute. And again, we've touched on this. Groundhog acute is what we should all be doing at the first hint of any infection. And it doesn't matter what that infection is. And as discussed, it's vitamin C to bowel tolerance. It's the iodine salt pipe. It's maybe using herbs. It's maybe using heating regimes. It's certainly taking time off and resting up to allow the immune system to fight the infection. And then I have what I call groundhog chronic. And groundhog chronic is a list of all the interventions, which is all that's gone before, plus some bolt-on extras, which might include herbal antivirals or antifungals or antibacterials. It might include sunshine, because sunshine is another very good way of killing infections. It might include heating regimes, which is a very good way of detoxing and pulling mycotoxins out and other nasty toxins out. So, and I wouldn't give anybody any prescription drug until groundhog chronic is well established. Again, all those regimes, yes, they're in my book, but they're also free on my website. So if you want to have a look at those, help yourself, they're there for anybody to view. So that's kind of my overall workup at the starting point, to treat any condition.
In terms of the CFS-ME difference, I mean, if there's a mitochondrial problem, doesn't that automatically predispose people to more inflammatory responses?
It does, but I think about these, in a logical way, because that's how my patients can get their heads around it. You see, the regimes are difficult and they are hard work. And if people get lost on the route, they give up. If they have a very clear idea in their mind of the path they're walking and the road ahead, they will stick with the regimes. And of course, in the business of correcting mitochondria, then yes, of course, that's going to impact on the inflammation aspect of things. And the inflammation aspect thing is going to impact on energy delivery mechanisms. But I think of them in this roadmap to empower patients to understand where I'm coming from, where we're going, where they're going to end up, and also to analyze their symptoms. So when things start to go wrong, they can work out for themselves where it's going wrong. Because the fact of the matter is, there aren't enough physicians, there aren't enough doctors to treat everybody as they should be treated. And as you know, the word doctor, it comes from the Latin, it means to teach, and docere. And my job is to teach my patients to recognize the road signs, to work out the mechanisms, and thereby put in place a logical treatment. And I've just done another book which is called Ecological Medicine, which is it's on my website now. I think it's going to be launched in July sometime, and that goes through all these basic regimes that I talk about, plus what I call the bolt-on extras. The other tools we can use over and above groundhog regimes, which and guess what? They're all cheap. They're all available to anybody. You don't need a doctor to put these things in place. You can all do these things yourself. Even B12 injections, which I love to use. Anybody can get those online now without a doctor's prescription, and the potential for harm is zero. As a colleague of mine commented, the only way you could kill yourself with vitamin B12 injections would be to drown in B12. You know, it's a joy to use. It's a fabulously safe tool, and it's one of those wonderful multitasking tools that does so much. Great for mitochondria. It's a very good antioxidant. It's a good anti-inflammatory. It's antiviral. It's essential for to read DNA. It's important to detox in the methylation cycle. So it's a great multitasking tool. And all the tools I use, you know, like vitamin C, like iodine, like sunshine, like herbs, you know, they all multitask in many ways. So, you know, even if you don't get the package absolutely perfect, you know, if you don't get it quite right, you know, you only have to get 51% well, because if you get 51% well, the body will do the rest. It has the resources, it has the energy to heal and repair itself. If you're only 49% there, you're still on the slippery slope downhill. So, you know, sometimes it's only that last extra thing that you add on that makes the world a difference. Now, of course, my job as a doctor is to listen to somebody's story and say, and maybe point out a few shortcuts. But increasingly these days, I say to people, no, you've got to do it all. And that's why I feel the workshops that I run are effective, because we've all got to do the PK diet. We've all got to take a basic package of supplements. You know, we've all got to pay attention to our mitochondria, and then, you know, look at the thyroid and the adrenal issues and the sleep issues. And when we got all that tidied up, then we start thinking about the chronic infections and the chronic inflammations. So I hope it's a very clear road forward.
How does mast cell activation tie into the CFS-ME?
Well, you know, that is obviously an area where the immune system is misbehaving. You know, the immune system is too twitchy. You know, it's in a pro-inflammatory state. So we put in place, you know, all the interventions to damp down inflammation, which of course starts with, you know, a ketogenic diet, because ketones, you know, sugars and carbohydrates are very pro-inflammatory. As soon as you're in ketosis, you're in an anti-inflammatory state. Improving mitochondrial function, as you mentioned earlier, you know, poor mitochondrial function results in inflammation. You know, the thyroid gland and the adrenal glands, get those right, and they both exert anti-inflammatory actions. You know, what do the doctors love to use to treat inflammation? Well, steroids, which is, you know, a product of the adrenal gland. And so many people with fatigue syndromes, their adrenals are underfunctioning, and that puts them into a pro-inflammatory state. And then we have various, you know, tools of the trade which are very good at damping down inflammation, like high-dose vitamin D, you know, like vitamin B12 injections, like detoxing, because toxins will trigger an inflammatory state, like sorting out the fermenting gut. And all these things I find just, you know, and vitamin C to bowel tolerance. Vitamin C in high doses is a very good antihistamine. And, you know, when you get all these things in place, problems like mast cell activation just kind of, you know, fade away into the background. But having said all that, you know, I sometimes get, you know, very sick patients who don't tolerate any of these infections. And I'm on a very steep learning curve with another technique called microimmunotherapy. Now, this is a homeopathic technique. Again, there's a whole page on my website that describes what it's all about and how it works. And it uses homeopathic concentrations of a whole range of immune system intermediaries, like cytokines, like lymphokines, like prostaglandins, like specific nucleic acids, in order, as I call it, to reprogram the immune system. Now, many of these therapies have already been trialed in placebo-controlled double-blind trials. Many of these remedies are already available in Belgium under government license for conventional doctors to use. So there's a very good evidence base that they're efficacious. And we can choose, the way they've been designed is that they can be used for clinical pictures or clinical situations. So, for example, the remedy I like to use best of all is the Epstein-Barr virus remedy. Why? Because over 80% of patients with ME, the Epstein-Barr virus is causally involved with post-viral MEs, I beg your pardon. But Epstein-Barr virus is causal. Not my words, but the words of Dr. Martin Lerner, who's published 4 papers on post-viral, post-Epstein-Barr virus MEs, and he's been treating, or he treats that with valacyclovir. But, you know, the remedy EBV is very helpful. You know, your own idea, Stephen, the use of BHT, fantastically helpful. And again, anybody can access BHT. It's effective for all the lipid coat viruses. You know, you can happily start patients on 2,000 milligrams a day, no problem at all. You know, very helpful intervention. Chinese skull cap. I've been through all the Stephen Booner books and pulled out the remedies which he uses most often, so the least expensive, which again multitask, which have minimal side effects. Chinese skull cap, 10 grams a day. It's an inexpensive treatment. Anybody can get that on Amazon. And the battle against these microbes, whatever that microbe happens to be, it's not a battle, it's a war. And the analogy I always quote is the example of Henry V, who tried to get the French out of Harfleur in 1415. And he didn't get them out of that castle by just using a battering ram or a few arrows or some spears or poison. He did it all. He starved them out, he froze them out, he assailed the castle in every which way he could to finally get there. And it took a long time, and it was jolly hard work. And it's exactly the same with anybody with any chronic infection. You hit it all which ways you possibly can. You starve them out with PK diet, you kill them with vitamin C to bowel tolerance, you use iodine, you use sunshine, you use heating therapies, you use herbals, and you improve energy delivery mechanisms. And you get all that in place, and you have a very good chance of empowering your immune system to get rid of the microbes, without resorting to expensive, prescription antimicrobials or whatever.
Can you put the ketosis program or the paleo program in the context of modern trends towards, let's say, veganism versus the carnivore diet as extremes?
Okay, well, anybody says to me, where are the trials to show that paleo ketogenic diet is the most desirable one? My answer to them is, well, there's a very, very good trial, and it's called 200 million years of human evolution. And here we are, an incredibly vigorous and successful species as a result. So what did primitive man eat? Well, he was a hunter-gatherer, and his diet varied, throughout the seasons. So, and of course, part of the success of Homo sapiens is the fact that we can eat such a wide variety of foods, and we have a dual fuel system. So when Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa, the first thing that happened is he had to deal with winter. And to deal with winter, food is going to be scarce. Hunting is going to be difficult. It's cold. You need lots of energy to survive. And what happened to Homo sapiens is, in the autumn, we have a natural autumn harvest where the fruit ripens, where the pulses ripen, where the cereals come. And those are all carbohydrate foods. And primitive man became able, through whatever mechanism, to eat those foods and get fat on them. And eating carbohydrates switches on an addictive gene, an addictive tendency, and we eat them in an addictive way. So we don't stop eating them when we're full, we go on eating them. And you end up eating 3 meals a day and snacks as well. And that's what primitive man did in the autumn. And what happened? He got fat. And from an evolutionary perspective, for surviving winter, fat is a massive benefit. Obviously it's insulating, but more importantly, it's a food source. And if you hibernate and you have good fat sources, you can last for a jolly long time without needing to eat at all. Now, primitive man had to give up his carbohydrates because he had no choice. They ran out, they went rotten. And so he either hibernated or he went back into winter hunting mode. And winter hunting mode is what? Meat, fish, fowl, whatever he could gather. And so through necessity, he returned to a ketogenic diet. So primitive man would have fueled his body with fat and meat for most of the year, bar the autumn, where he had a windfall. He had a carbohydrate, bonanza, he had a harvest. Now, where does veganism fit into that? Nowhere at all. Now, some vegans may choose to they justify their veganism on the grounds that, oh, well, we can save the world, we can feed the world, by going vegan. And I'm not sure if that's right or not, but what I do know is that when I'm advising the person in front of me, I'm not saving the world, I'm advising the person in front of me. I want what is best for that patient sitting in front of me. And my view is based on 200 million years of evolution, that we should be eating a paleo ketogenic diet. Most of the time, we should be running on ketones and then eating foods that are in season as they come available. And I don't think you can do better than that.
What about the carnivore idea where It's not just, let's say, meat for the winter or, you know, scattered around during the year, but it's, you know, animal flesh as the dietary staple.
Well, yes, and for some of my patients, that's the only thing they can survive on. I'll just tell you a lovely story of a girl called Jo, and I know she won't mind me her name because her history is in the ecological medicine, her case history. She came to me about 8 years ago, I suppose now, and she came to me primarily. She was in her early 40s, primarily because her mother and her grandmother developed dementia by the age of 50, and she was worried that she was going down the same route. Now, she also had a chronic fatigue syndrome, but she came to me primarily for the dementia. And to cut a very, very long story short, the three key things that worked like a charm for her was first, paleo-ketogenic diet. Secondly, vitamin B12 injections. She got terrific mental and physical energy boost from that. And thirdly, sorting out her thyroid. She was obviously grossly hypothyroid, and it hadn't been diagnosed because her blood tests had not been correctly interpreted. But those were three key things that made the difference to her. And over the first few years, her weight dropped from 17 stone to 9 stone. So she lost 8 stone over that time. Her energy levels picked up terrifically. She felt well. Every year, she goes to have psychometric testing at St. Francis Hospital to make sure her brain is tip-top, and her brain is better than it's ever been. She's certainly not on the way to dementia. She got married, got herself a motorbike, so she's roaring around the country on a BMW, holding down a full-time job. Anyway, she came to see me about 3 years ago, and I said, well, how are you getting on with the diet? Oh, she said, well, what I find suits me is 800 grams of ribeye steak once a day, and that's all I eat. Well, that wasn't something I'd advise. That's what she'd chosen to do, and she just very lightly fries it, so it's effectively almost raw. So, oh, crumbs, okay, well, let's have a look. What supplements are you taking? And we went through supplements, and I said, oh, the only thing that slightly worries me is iodine. You know, I think you ought to take some iodine. No, she said, let's measure it. So we did. We did her urinary iodines at Biolab, and guess what? She had plenty of iodine on board because she'd spent all her food budget went on the best steak she could buy from grass-fed beef. And I think it makes the point that yes, we can function perfectly well as pure carnivores. But guess what? I'm greedy. You know, I like my crunchy salads. You know, I like my PK bread. You know, I like my Grace coconut milk, and I like my berries. You know, I'm greedy. I like the variety. But I can stay in ketosis by eating those things, and I can stay well eating those things. I have to say, a tool that I've used increasingly these days is a ketone breath meter. It's a very useful tool because it helps people stay on track with the ketogenic diet. It's very easy to use. You just turn it on, and it takes 20 seconds to warm up. So there you see the countdown. It's going to count down from 20. And when it gets to 0, it beeps. When it beeps, you blow into it. When it beeps again, you stop blowing into it. And that measures ketones in the breath in part per million. And the point is, if you're blowing any amount, you've done well enough. So here we go. Okay, so I blew for a few seconds. It's beeped a second time. I don't know if you can hear that. And then in a few seconds, it'll throw the result up, which shows me that I'm blowing 7.8 parts per million of ketones. Now, some people worry if their blood ketones are too high. You know, that's a higher reading than I might normally get, probably because my body is saying, you need lots of energy, you need lots of ketones, so you can entertain these lot for an hour or so. So my ketones are running high at the moment because, you know, I'm trying to put on a good performance for you guys. But the only thing that the wretched doctors know about ketosis is diabetic ketoacidosis. And if you go to your doctor and you say, oh, I'm blowing 7.8, he'll panic, oh, get into hospital, you know, you're diabetic ketoacidosis. Rubbish. If you're not diabetic and your blood sugars are fine, it doesn't matter what ketones you blow, so long as you're in ketosis. Then you know you're doing the diet sufficiently well to power your mitochondria with the most desirable fuel, i.e. ketones.
Have you ever run across people who have a problem with being on ketosis 24/7 where they need to cycle back and forth?
Well, yes, I have had people who have problems being on ketones 24/7. And my guess, and in fact, my clinical experience now, I've been doing this for some time, is that is a symptom of hypothyroidism. Now, the point here is that, you know, if all is well, being in ketosis means you're fat burning with thyroid hormones. And guess what? When people are thyrotoxic, you know, they're in roaring ketosis, they're in roaring fat burning. So we know you need thyroid hormones to fat burn. Now, if you are hypothyroid, and hypothyroidism is incredibly common in Western countries and incredibly badly treated. I mean, Kenneth Blanchard, consultant endocrinologist, reckons that 40% of Western women are hypothyroid. And guess what? In the chronic fatigue syndrome ME community is going to be much, much higher. You need thyroid hormones to fat burn. Now, if you haven't got the thyroid hormones to fat burn, then you fat burn with adrenaline instead. And having high levels of adrenaline is a rather nasty feeling. You know, you feel stressed, you feel anxious. I call it ketogenic hypoglycemia. You get all the symptoms of hypoglycemia, and it may be your blood sugars are low, but it doesn't matter because you've got plenty of ketones around. So that clue of, I just don't get on with the ketogenic diet, I can't stick it, it makes me feel ill, is a very, very major clue that you're hypothyroid and you need to sort your thyroid out. Now, again, I could talk all day about thyroid conditions, but the bottom line is you are not going to get adequate thyroid treatment from your regular GP or your regular consultant. Why? Because the only thing they look at is the blood test. And if the blood test is within population reference range, then there's nothing wrong with you and off you go. So what that means is that the blood test for thyroid disorders can be very misleading. Now, it doesn't mean I don't want blood tests for all my patients. Of course, we start off with the blood test. And I do that for two reasons. First of all, I want to make sure that person is thyrotoxic. The last thing we want to do is start people on thyroid supplements when they're already thyrotoxic. But the blood test gives us an idea if there's biochemical scope for a trial of thyroid hormones. So it's the starting point. So then I want some clinical information. Is that patient hypothyroid clinically? So the ketogenic hypoglycemia would be a very useful clue. Thyroid hormones are central to our circadian rhythm. And if you're hypothyroid, you will tend to be an owl. So people who say, I can't drop off to sleep until midnight and I don't wake up until 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, that's another major clue that they're hypothyroid. I then want to know what their core temperature is. The point here is that the core temperature is a function of 4 inputs. It's a function of those 4 energy delivery mechanisms that we talked about earlier, i.e. the PK diet, good mitochondrial function, good thyroid function, good adrenal function. And if they are all functioning well, then you have a normal core temperature. So if your core temperature is low, it tells you, one or a combination of those things is not working well. So again, this is why it's very important that there's a certain order about getting people well. You start off with the PK diet. You then take vitamin C to bowel tolerance to deal with the fermenting gut, because if you've got a fermenting gut, you will malabsorb. And then all those expensive supplements you're taking, they won't be feeding you, they'll be feeding those microbes in the upper fermenting gut. So then you take the basic package of supplements, and then you take some mitochondrial supplements to support mitochondria. And the details of the doses are all on my website and in the books. I'm not going to go through that now. So once you've got the fuel in the tank right and the engine working reasonably well, what that means is that any variations in temperature are a function of thyroid or the adrenal gland. So what I then like my patients to do is to measure their core temperatures several times a day over 4 consecutive days. The point here being is that the average temperature is a reflection of thyroid function, and the degree by which it fluctuates is a reflection of adrenal function. And we can correct both those things using glandulars. Now, I don't know if you Americans in particular are familiar with Agatha Christie's The Mousetrap. It's a very popular play. It's the longest running show in London. And at the beginning of The Mousetrap, the whole audience are sworn to secrecy. Don't go out and tell the world who the baddie is, or it's going to spoil the show for people yet to come. It's the same with adrenal and thyroid glandulars. I'm going to let you into a secret. They do contain active thyroid ingredients, and they work fabulously well. So do use the glandulars, but don't tell your doctors, don't tell your endocrinologist, because that's a sure way to get them banned and taken off the market. Stephen's having a giggle here. Sounds like you've been through the same evolution.
Yeah, that's always a big question where, there's kind of this expectation that anybody who writes or gives advice says, make sure you tell your doctor what you're doing. And most people can't handle the grief they get in doing that.
Well, the shameful thing is, and I have to say, sometimes I'm ashamed to be a member of the medical profession. I find the doctors increase the biochemical friction. They stop people getting well because, instead of saying what they should say, this is the honest replies, look, I don't know, but it's a journey, I'll walk it with you and maybe I'll learn something on the way. That's the honest thing to say. And that's what I've been saying for the last 40 years. And it's been a very helpful policy, I have to say. I have learned a lot. But, what I'm saying is you have to take control of yourself, your health, yourself, because your doctors aren't going to get you well unless they're a very special doctor. Even the best ones are a bit nervous about this and say, oh, okay, I'll watch things from a distance, but don't blame me if it goes wrong. So you must use these things. You must learn to use them well. You must monitor yourself very carefully clinically. And I like regular measurements of blood pressure, of pulse, of core temperature, of how do you feel. And we increase the dose very slowly and very gently, keeping everything else in place. As I say, I describe this as, conducting the chronic fatigue syndrome orchestra. And, if you can conduct it well and get all the players, playing, at the right pitch, at the right tempo, together, you will get a melody that will last you for life. And it means I can give my patients a very positive message, which is, okay, you've had a shit few years, you've had, or even decades, but your best years are ahead of you. And you put all this stuff in place and you will live to a ripe and healthy, old age. And that's what I want to do, because guess what? I'm having fun. I want to live life at a high level. And okay, when the moment comes, I want to fall off the cliff, very steeply. It may be falling off a horse and breaking my neck for the 4th time. No, but I'm not going to have a slow, a painful demise into an early grave. I'm going to live my life to its full potential in terms of quality and quantity. Oh, crumbs. I tend to wander off the point. Bring me back, Stephen. What do you want me to talk about?
Well, there's always a new question. Palmer asks about mold and Lyme disease and mold sensitivities with people with autoimmune diseases. And other than, let's say, getting out of a moldy environment, how do you approach that?
Well, you've absolutely put your finger on it. Whilst you're in a moldy environment, you are going to struggle to get well. If you want to assess how bad the moldy environment is, the urinary mycotoxin test is a helpful test. Now, I have to say, I've never seen a normal result. Everybody has got some mold there. Nearly everybody's got a bit of octotoxin or maybe aflatoxin. And that's always there as a background level. So if I just have, 1 or 2 at fairly lowish levels, I don't worry about it too much. Because if the humidity in your country is over 40%, there will be molds there. So that's the first point. If you're living in a moldy environment, you've got to get out of it. I've tried endless techniques, dehumidifiers or major building works. Sometimes that can help. But believe you me, I have a hardcore of patients who tell me, when I go on holiday to a hot, dry climate, when I go to mountain skiing, I feel absolutely great. And my answer to that is, well, you go and live there then, matey, because it's the cheapest way to get well. And if it's a choice between being ill in a moldy climate and being well in a dry climate, well, in my view, it's a no-brainer. I do see there are lots of things getting in the way, cultural things and family ties. But, Palmer, you've just jumped in with the most difficult question that you could ask me. And I would love to be able to say, oh, just do this, or just do that, and you'll be as right as rain. And it just ain't like that. And the key point to remember about allergy problems is that allergies often follow overdoses of things. And the parallel with immunology is exactly the same. So, for example, if you're a young child and you get a dose of measles, and you get a measles infection, which in a young child is a benign illness and doesn't cause any problems at all. What that means is you make antibodies against that measles virus. And if in the future you come across it, the body reacts allergically to it, gets rid of PDQ, and that's the end of that. The point here is that allergy almost always follows toxicity. And this really came home to me in the 1990s when I just moved to another area. This area here, it's a farming area. And at that time, organophosphate chemicals, every farmer in area was being exposed to and poisoned by these organophosphate chemicals. Now, some of them had really good, through pure luck and genetics, had good detox systems, and they could get rid of the organophosphates fairly well. But some of the farmers, and it's about a third of the population of slow detoxifiers, were poisoned by the organophosphate. Now, if the body gets poisoned by something, and it doesn't matter what that something is, measles virus is a sort of poison. Electromagnetic radiation is a sort of poison. Molds are another sort of poison. If the body gets poisoned by something, it learns. It's intelligent. The immune system is intelligent, just like the brain's intelligent. It learns that's a baddie. I've got to recognize that in the future and give my body such nasty symptoms that it learns to avoid it and never goes there again. It's a little bit like primitive man trotting through the jungle. He eats a little red berry and not sure about that. Next time he eats it, he vomits it, and he thinks, never again. I was poisoned by that. I'm not going again. And his allergy would be, well, I'm going to avoid it. So it's all part of the immune education and the brain education to guide us safely through life. But now, of course, we live in such a toxic world. It's very difficult to avoid all the toxins that come along. I don't know if you're going to be assailed by we're going to be assailed by 5G. It's an absolute freaking disaster. We're going to be effectively poisoned by it. Our immune system is going to recognize that as a baddie and give us nasty symptoms to try to make us take avoidance action. You can't. It's all pervasive. I have one of my patients who until very recently was living in a field about 10 miles from here, in the middle of nowhere, because he was so electrically sensitive. He was intolerant of 4G, 3G, 2G, and 1G. He was intolerant of Wi-Fi, mobile phones, the lot. And thankfully, we managed to relocate him in the middle of Spain, so at least he's warm and he's being better fed. And I'm hoping that the freedom from electromagnetic stress for a sufficiently long length of time will allow his immune system to readjust and become more tolerant. And of course, that is the basis of any sort of desensitization. Avoid something for as long as you reasonably can, and then reprogram the immune system, in some way or another. Now, my favorite tool used to be EPD, which is a great tool. It works really well, but the trouble is patients have to come and see me for it, and I can't treat the whole world, and it's expensive. And this is why I'm moving to microimmunotherapy, because anybody can access microimmunotherapy. I'm setting up a system so that anybody can access it with a little bit of professional guidance, but it's a cheap, efficient intervention that anybody can get hold of.
I got a question here about what your recommended way of assessing core temperature is.
Oh, well, the best way is rectal. That's the most accurate core temperature. But, us Brits don't like putting things in our bottoms. So, we're not going to do that. So sublingual is pretty good. And the sublingual temperature is usually about 0.3 or 0.4 below core temperature. Ear temperature is not too bad. And of course, they're very easy to do. If I get results that are way out and people are coming to me and say, oh, my core temperature is 35, I say, well, you've got to check a rectal at least once, just to make sure that your sublingual temperature really is just 0.3 or 0.4 below core rectal temperatures. But the digital thermometers are incredibly quick and convenient. I haven't got one on my desk to demonstrate it, but you can put it under the tongue. It beeps when it's stable, and it gives you a digital reading. So they're ideal.
Yeah, one of the things that I've started asking people to do is to measure the difference between their core temperature and their peripheral temperature as one way to judge whether or not what the context of the core temperature is. That if the shoulders and the hips have shut down circulation, then that's a sign that you're preserving your core temperature actively.
Absolutely, and it's an indirect measure of cardiac output, and cardiac output is quite a good measure of your energy delivery mechanisms.
Yeah, so this kind of a thermometer may not be as accurate, but in terms of getting a core temperature and a peripheral temperature in split seconds. It's incredibly convenient.
Oh, well, I'm not familiar with that device. Send me a link and I'll have a look at that, Stephen. That could be very helpful.
It's just an infrared thermometer, and you can do wall temperatures and you can do all kinds of things. It's more of an industrial device, but it's just like you point and shoot, and it just picks up the infrared signature from whatever that surface is, and it's kind of plus or minus, a half a degree instead of a tenth of a degree. So it's not as precise, but it's incredibly fast and convenient for people who are really, really busy.
Well, that's a really interesting idea, because one of the tools I love to use is a far infrared thermography. And as you know, a thermogram is a heat picture. And it's a fantastic way, for example, of picking up breast tumors or mastitis or cysts or whatever. And it's incredibly sensitive. And each photograph is peculiar. It's like a fingerprint. It's peculiar to that person, and therefore you can track changes very well. But the trouble is, it's rather expensive. I know patients have to travel, and it's I know £200 or £300 for a heat photograph. I'm just waiting for the day when we can have an app on our mobile phones and we can all do our own heat photographs to look at blood flow and pathology and so on and so forth. But that device sounds like a perfect kind of interim measure that use themselves to detect inflammation in the body or whatever. So please send me the link. I'd love to get one of those and have a play with it.
Yeah, there's also the problem with it is that it's a point source measurement, and if you don't point it at the right source, you may not see a focal pathology like a breast hotspot, or if somebody has a cellular parasite on board in their muscles, you won't see that hotspot because you don't think to point the device at that particular tissue.
Yeah, fair comment. No, we need an app for a mobile phone that measures a far infrared in as a precise a way as the big machines do.
We have another question about nebulized hydrogen peroxide as an alternative to the iodine. Have you worked with that as much? It's something that Tom Levy recommends.
Well, I've never used with that, but I know Tom Levy is a good doctor, and if he says it's a good idea, it's a good idea. But I work with the things that I'm very familiar with. And one of the things I have been trying is nebulized vitamin C. And again, we've got some very good results back with that. But the key point to remember about vitamin C is you mustn't nebulize ascorbic acid because it's an acid. So if you're going to nebulize vitamin C, then it needs to be neutralized first. And working from basic chemistry, essentially 2 parts of ascorbic acid by weight to 1 part of sodium bicarbonate. And guess what? Anyone gets sodium bicarbonate. It's cooking in baking soda. Gives you a neutral solution. It's a quite a good tip for some patients who don't tolerate the acidity of ascorbic acid, especially when they're first using it. It means they can then drink a neutral solution of vitamin C and tolerate it much better and as easily, because you combine those 2 things together and you get carbon dioxide that bubbles off, and you're left with the sodium ascorbate, which is a neutral solution. But nebulizing that, yes, keen on that. You can buy nebulizers from Amazon or eBay for about £15. They're also called atomizers. And so you can put the neutral vitamin C in that and nebulize that. Again, get very good results.
How about the potential of the interaction of supplemented iodine with thyroid hormones and the possibility of, let's say, maybe a goiter or something like that?
Well, anybody who has almost any thyroid condition will be iodine deficient. And in fact, iodine deficiency is pandemic. In somebody who is not taking supplements and who's not eating a PK diet, I've yet to see a normal iodine. People are invariably deficient. Now, if somebody has a thyroid problem, then the thyroid will be actively scavenging iodine. And if you suddenly give them a big supply of iodine, it'll temporarily go into overdrive. And you might get a few days when the thyroid gland is a bit too busy and pouring out too many thyroid hormones. And some people do say, oh, I feel a bit hyper. In that event, reduce the dose of iodine, build it up gradually, and an equilibrium will be established. So I have to say, I don't have any concerns about using iodine in thyroid disorders, whether that's hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism or autoimmunity or whatever. It's a fantastic tool.
There was one question or comment where somebody said that her husband had used topical iodine and had a horrible reaction that ended up scarring. And I've used topical iodine, you know, on and off for decades and never seen that kind of reaction. Any idea what might have been going on with that?
Yeah, he overdosed with it. You know, if you, I mean, I'll just give you an example. You know, whenever I'm out in the garden, I carry my iodine with me all the time. It's brilliant for any insect bites, bee stings, cuts, or whatever. But I didn't put the lid on properly, and so it leaked into my pocket. I thought, oh, that's funny. It feels a bit funny. And guess what? You know, it leaked into it and it burnt my leg. So you know, it's not sore anymore. But he was just overdosing with it. He was just using it too enthusiastically. And of course, you know, you can kill anybody with an overdose of anything. You know, an overdose of water is called drowning. So that doesn't mean we should never use water. You know, it's an essential part of being well. So he just took too much and burnt himself.
Susan, do you have any questions stacked up that?
Yeah. One thing that you do excellently, Sarah, is you're letting the layman know how to go through this process of healing, so you don't go to a functional medicine expert and spend thousands on these tests. And you start with the PK diet, then vitamin C to bowel tolerance to help the upper fermenting gut, and that basically clears the dysbiosis. Then you look at the thyroid, your temperature, and if it's low and steady, that's thyroid. But if it's varying, it's adrenals. So I think your approach would be, you know, address that. I mean, maybe glandulars. Then you get to the detox, which I think is brilliant, because rather than using the IV EDTA or DMSA, you've got a thing that, the layman can do at home, and without going to all these expensive, overcharging functional medicine practitioners who are a little bit better than the allopathic. So tell us about your detox methods, because what you do is brilliant.
Okay. Well, first of all the stuff that we talked about already will start the detox process. A major source of toxins are chemicals from the fermenting gut. Because if you're eating sugars and carbohydrates and you've got an upper fermenting gut, what do they get fermented to? Really nasty toxic compounds like alcohol, D-lactate, hydrogen sulfide, ammoniacal compounds. And then also we have the products, the microbes themselves. You have bacterial endotoxin and you have fungal mycotoxins. So just the business of eating a PK diet and taking vitamin C to bowel tolerance will reduce your toxic load massively. That then leaves us with two groups of toxins, which I define by the way by which, right, my friendly dog has just come to greet me. Defined by the way in which we detox. Now, most toxins like pesticides, volatile organic compounds, smells, scents, perfumes, cleaning agents, most of those compounds can be detoxified easily by heating regimes. Now, the idea here is you get the body hot, warm, you literally boil those chemicals off from the subcutaneous fat onto the lipid layer of the surface of the skin, and then you shower and you wash them off. And it doesn't matter which heating regime you use. It doesn't matter if you go sunbathing. If you've got the energy to, you can go and exercise and get hot and shower off, and that will detox. A traditional sauna works really well. Turkish sauna, it doesn't matter. You do whichever one suits you. Now, the very sick chronic fatigue syndrome ME patients, they do not tolerate heat at all well. And so for those patients, I recommend a far infrared sauna. It's another way of getting warm, but you can do it in a much more controlled and a much more gentle way. But the key thing is whichever heating regime you use, you then need to shower off subsequently. So I've now collected data on about 30 patients where I've done tested toxicity before and after. And that's given me a pretty good feel for how these work. You might think, well, 30 patients isn't very many, but the results were very consistent. In every case, the toxic load came down. And I don't do tests on patients unnecessarily. So I can now, because they're expensive, you know, I'd rather patients spend their money on good supplements or good food or a good holiday. So I now can say with some confidence, you do these regimes and the toxic load will come down. And roughly speaking, 50 such heating regimes will halve your toxic load. 50 halves it again, another 50 halves it again. You never get to zero because we live in equilibrium with our polluted world. But the lower the level you can get, the better. And my view is even fit and healthy people should be doing a heating regime at least once a week, just to kind of, just to stay well. Now, the thing about those heating regimes, they work really well for pesticides and volatile organic compounds, but they don't work for heavy metals. We need another detox regime for heavy metals, and there are lots of ways you can do this. You can use clays in the gut, which, because many heavy metals get excreted in bile and they are collated up by clays. You can take good doses of minerals, which displace heavy metals from their binding sites, and then glutathione, which then grabs them. So a very good way of getting rid of lead, for example, is to use zinc 30 milligrams plus glutathione 250 milligrams twice a day. That's a very good way of doing it. Or selenium works in a similar way. But I do sometimes have people who've got, who've been well and truly poisoned by dental amalgam, by lead water pipes or whatever. And we can show that in a urine test with DMSO, which is an oral chelating agent. For those patients, we can get rid of those reliably well using oral DMSO. And the dosing rate is 15 milligrams per kilogram. You take a weekly dose every week for, well, depends how toxic they are, maybe 10 weeks, 16 weeks or whatever, and recheck afterwards. But again, these are tests you can do from home. You don't need a special, yes, you need to use a laboratory, and you can detox either using the RAGE techniques I've talked about or the DMSA, DMSA techniques. If you don't want to use DMSA, then I do recommend you look at Andy Cutler's website. Andy Cutler has a protocol for detoxing heavy metals, which is a proven benefit. It's a very useful website, and it takes you through it, holds your hand, takes you through it, and that will help you with the heavy metal detoxing.
And what is the DMSA, oral DMSA? What is that called and how do we find it?
Well, its chemical name is dimethyl succinic acid, and its trade name is, it's called Captomer, Captomer, and you can get it on eBay. That's where I get it at the moment, and it costs about £1.50 for each capsule, and each capsule is 100 milligrams. So each detox regime will cost you, I know, 10 or 12 quid, I suppose. So it's not cheap, but it's much cheaper than going to a clinic, and it's very safe. You can do it yourself. But what I do recommend, especially if you're a sick patient, is just start off with, a quarter of a capsule or half a capsule at a time, because some people don't tolerate the regime very well as they mobilize the metals. And so if you're very sick, start off with low doses. But I have to say, that is unusual. Most people tolerate it absolutely fine and just don't know they're taking it.
One comment you made that was very interesting is, like with fragrances, if you can smell it, it's in your brain. Can you tell us a little about that?
That is correct. I mean, the olfactory nerve, which is the first cranial nerve that does scent, that is a direct extension of the brain itself. So it's an illustration of how toxic some of these chemicals are, because if you can smell it, it's in the brain. And of course, the brain is super sensitive to any toxic stress. And and again, with people who have multiple chemical sensitivity, i.e. people who have already been poisoned by a chemical and are super sensitive to it, so their brain knows that the slightest smell, they've got to leave the area before it causes terrible damage. They will detect molecules at a much lower level than the average person who hasn't been so sensitized. And it's a feature of multiple chemical sensitivity that they have, sufferers have this exquisite sense of smell, and they will react badly to wash powders on a visitor's clothing, for example. And I've got one poor lady who has severe chemical sensitivity at home, and all her carers, know they can't use any fragrance, they can't use, all their clothes have to be washed in a non-scented soap, they can't use perfumes, they can't use air fresheners, otherwise it makes her acutely ill as soon as they walk into the room. So it's just a lovely illustration of how toxic chemicals can be, and that is mediated by the olfactory nerve. If you can smell it, it's in the brain. And these patients with multiple chemical sensitivity are saying, get rid of that nasty stuff before you poison me.
So what do these hypersensitive individuals do that wheeze if somebody walks by with perfume or a cigarette?
It's a nightmare for them. You know, they get sick is the answer. And it makes for a miserable life. You know, they are permanently locked down in a safe environment. They can only work from home. I mean, we've got 1 or 2 patients who just have to live in the middle of nowhere because often chemical sensitivity goes with electrical sensitivity. And guess what? We're going to see epidemics of electrical sensitivity with 5G coming along, because 5G, the reason we have this 5th generation of electromagnetic radiation is because, you know, the electronic industry wants us all to be carrying around devices where we can mobile, you know, we can live stream films or whatever. Now, the point about those things is they require a huge information flow. And for something to carry a huge information flow, it's got to be very energetic. And believe you me, 5G is very energetic. And we already know that it disrupts calcium gradients across biological membranes. Now, that's not just your membrane or my membrane. That's the whole of nature. You know, everything living, grass, trees, insects, you know, horses, cats, humans, we all run on membrane potentials. And if you upset those membrane potentials, then you are going to upset the functioning of every cell in the whole of nature. So the potential for harm is enormous. Now, obviously, the sick people are going to go down first because they've already got impaired membrane potentials for whatever reason. But I think 5G is a very, very dangerous instrument. I think we should do all within our power to stop it, because the potential for harm is so enormous.
What can the people with hypersensitivity or chemical sensitivity do to get better? I mean, avoiding the chemicals, yes, but what do they do to get their body better?
Well, the immune system, you know, is clever, and it will slowly reprogram itself. And my experience is that the longer you can avoid something, and the more you can put in place, you know, anti-inflammatory interventions like all the things we've discussed, then the more likely they are to become tolerant, maybe tolerate a little bit in the future. But there is no easy path, believe you me. Chemical sensitivity is very difficult. I would love to say, oh, there's a good microimmunotherapy treatment for multiple chemical sensitivity, but I'm not aware of one at the moment. Maybe that is something that will evolve. But just anything you do to damp down the immune system, low dose naltrexone, vitamin D, vitamin C, you know, iodine, all these things will just help the immune system damp down. And in the book, the Ecological Medicine book, you know, I've detailed the reprogramming of the immune system mechanisms that I know about, but it's a learning curve. It's a very steep one, and I'm still on it. In fact, when we did the book, I'm so lucky to have a very helpful publisher. And I said to Georgina, you know, my problem is I'm always finding out new things that need to go in the book. So we've sorted out a numbering system for the book, which is a little bit like the Bible. So it's chapter 1, verse 3 or something like that. So the point is, we've only printed a limited number of them, and I can update it very easily without upsetting the indexing system. So watch this space.
We have one question here. Do you recommend far infrared over near infrared? I mean, some saunas, you know, like go up to the waist, and what's your recommendation? I suspect you're going to say we need to sweat.
No, you don't need to sweat. That's an important point. Just getting hot will do it. Because some people get very, oh, I have to sit in there for half an hour, I don't sweat. That's not necessary. It's not a sweating mechanism that brings the chemicals out. It's a heating mechanism, because these chemicals are in the fat. They're not in the sweat, they're in the fat. And heating them up, mobilizing them, it makes them more active, it makes them shake, and they evaporate literally onto the lipid layer on the surface of the skin, and you then wash them off. So I really don't mind if you use sunshine or far infrared or near infrared. I tend to use far infrared because it's said to penetrate the skin efficiently. And far infrared has other beneficial effects on mitochondria, for example. It seems to improve mitochondrial function. That's another benefit. But the joy of the saunas, and in fact, I say saunas, what I like my patients to use is a far infrared sauna blanket, because they can then control how hot it is, how much skin is exposed, and the time very easily, i.e. they can gradually build up the dose. Because one of the problems of getting a sick patient very hot is they mobilize loads of chemicals and give themselves food poisoning. We start off low temperatures, small areas of the body, short times, and build up to hotter temperatures, more of the body, longer times. But the key thing is to shower off subsequently.
Any suggestions for osteoporosis?
Well, osteoporosis is an inevitable part of metabolic syndrome. If you're running on sugars and carbohydrates, you will get osteoporosis. So the starting point to treat osteoporosis is all the stuff we've talked about, the ketogenic diet, good supplements. Again, the most very important supplement for osteoporosis is magnesium and vitamin D. If you've got good levels of magnesium and vitamin D, you'll be highly protected against osteoporosis. But of course, people don't come to me saying, oh, I want to prevent osteoporosis, what shall I do? I'll just say to them, you do groundhog basic, the basic regimes that we should all be doing. They come to me with osteoporosis. Now, I so hate the bone builders, the Didronel-like drugs. They are very poorly tolerated. People feel dreadful on them, and they have, about 10% of people have potentially very, very severe side effects. So they are not my favorite drug by any means. The perfect treatment for osteoporosis is strontium. Now, and there are lots of studies which clearly show that strontium increased bone density and reduce fracture rates. It's a brilliant treatment. And strontium is a little bit like if you've got iron and you add carbon to it, you turn it to steel. Strontium is the same. You add strontium to that calcium matrix and you turn it to steel. You make bone incredibly tough. Now, strontium has got a bad reputation. And the reason for that is the drug companies worked out, oh, strontium's a really good treatment for osteoporosis. We must use it. But they can't use natural strontium because they can't patent it. It's trace elements. You can't patent things that are in the natural world. And so they made up an unnatural salt strontium called strontium ranelate. Worse than that, they then put it up in a mixture which was full of aspartame. So when patients in the NHS were prescribed strontium, they also got a nasty dose of strontium ranelate, and they got a nasty dose of aspartame as well. And guess what? It got a bad reputation because it caused blood clotting. So, but the blood clotting is a feature of aspartame poisoning, because believe me, the dose of aspartame was quite high. When it was tested in clinical trials, fantastic results with it. So now, of course, the doctors are being put off strontium because they've been told, though strontium causes increased clotting, it's dangerous. Just say it's not the strontium. So you use natural strontium, strontium carbonate or strontium chloride. It doesn't matter. It's fairly readily available, and you want to take 250 milligrams a day. Side effects, 0. It's very well tolerated. And even patients who haven't got osteoporosis, I say, well, take 1 a week or 2 a week, just to keep your bones tough. I mean, if anybody should have been killed because they had soft bones, it's me. The number of times I've fallen off horses. But, I think strontium and all the other things that I've done are how I've kept my bones strong. I have to say, falling off a horse is not a good test of whether you have osteoporosis or not. But equally, I'm not a great fan of bone density scans to measure osteoporosis. Why? Big dose of radiation. You can now, there are now ultrasound devices for measuring heel bone density. You don't have to be a doctor to have them. Many osteopaths now have them in their clinic. So if you want to know what condition your bones are in, go to find out a local person who uses ultrasound, and they can measure your heel bone density, and that's an accurate measure of bone. And guess what? No radiation. So, and you could have have an ultrasound of a heel done, every 6 months. Very cheap. I have a local guy who does it for £40, so it's a very cheap intervention, and you can make sure that the treatment is working.
Okay, Steve.
Have you had any experience with amaramide, or any of your colleagues or patients had experience with amaramide as a mercury chelating agent?
What's the chemical name of amaramide?
It's also called OSR or NBMI. It's something developed by Boyd Haley about 10 years ago, and it's an irreversible mercury chelator that's excreted through the fecal route instead of through the kidney.
Now, I'm ashamed to say I don't have any experience of using that, but I'd love to learn about that, because that could be very useful. Has he done trials to show that it's effective?
Yes, but it's very limited, and he's pissed off the FDA to such an extent that they can't do any research here in the States on it. But
Okay.
it's not approved anywhere yet. So it's all just being done as on an experimental basis, but they've used it to treat gold miners who use mercury to extract gold, and they have a massive mercury burden. And he's used it for that. And he's reported 2 cases of amazing responses of Miramide with COPD. And he's had a problem trying to explain how this is even possible.
How fascinating.
So,
Well, no, I'm ashamed I have no experience using it, but I love to hear about it. And you know, obviously, I don't recommend anything to my patients unless A, there's a good, you know, evidence base to show efficacy, and B, that it's biologically plausible and obviously safe. So I'd love to learn a bit more about it, because that could be a very useful intervention for those that don't tolerate DMSA or want to try another technique.
yeah, one of the things when you mentioned about vitamin C and baking soda, there is an option for people to buy sodium ascorbate pre-neutralized, and they can also buy magnesium ascorbate and calcium ascorbate, and they can even do their own blend to try to balance their electrolytes and the pH all at the same time. But one of the things that I wanted to mention is that ascorbic acid is the most stable for storage and for resistance to moisture. Sodium ascorbate is, you know, 10 times more reactive to moisture, and you have to be that much more careful about sealing the lid and storing it in plastic bags and things like that.
And the reason I like my mixes is because they're awfully cheap. And you know, many of my patients with chronic fatigue syndrome and ME, they haven't got buckets of money. And so if they can get things that are cheap and effective, they're much more likely to be able to go through with the treatments than if it's, you know, horribly expensive.
Yeah, we had also another question about the issue of smell, smelling something and getting into the brain as it might apply to essential oils and aromatherapy. Have people with chemical sensitivity used small molecules like essential oils therapeutically, or not?
Most of them are made ill by them.
Okay.
But you're absolutely right that this is the power of essential oils. They do get directly into the brain, where they have, you know, can have profound effects. I mean, one example of that is, you know, I'm looking out here and I've got a line of fields down there, and if I have a cow in the field here who comes on heat, then, you know, you can hear the bull lowering about 10 fields away. So, you know, the effect of pheromones, you know, in those are incredibly powerful. So those scents have, you know, profound effects. You know, an indirect, it wakes me up at night listening, you know, yelling away at her. But yes, but I don't know, but I can't think of any patient with MCS who would not be made more ill by aromatherapy, because it's a smell. And actually perfumes and scents, almost without exception, patients with MCS react badly to.
Mm-hmm. Even things like, let's say, vanillin.
Well, I'm not skillful with aromatherapy. I don't pretend to be, and I just don't know the answer to that. But I can suggest to my patients that maybe they can try that.
Yeah. So if a food has got, you know, vanilla in it, would that set people off? And if it's got let's say alcohol, if they smell wine or an distilled alcohol, do they react to that as well?
Yes, many would react to alcohol,
Mm-hmm.
And alcohol for most of those is an absolute no.
Got a question here about pollen allergy, and I know you covered allergies. Anything different about pollen allergies compared to others?
Well, you know, pollen allergy is an evolutionary error. I mean, an interesting study was done in Japan, where they looked at the incidence of pollen allergy in people in the cities compared to the countryside. The pollen counts are much higher in the countryside, so you'd expect, you know, to see more hay fever there. But the reverse was true. And the reason is it's air pollution. It was diesel particulates in the cities of Japan sticking onto pollen and acting as an adjuvant to switch on pollen allergy. I mean, before the Industrial Revolution, hay fever was virtually unheard of. It's certainly not described in the literature. So, you know, hay fever is a consequence of the polluted air in which we live. Now, obviously, once it's been switched on, it's difficult to switch it off. but there are techniques we can use to switch off pollinality, but having had it switched off, you don't want to switch it on again. So it's the old story, try and avoid the polluted environments. And then I use EPD for switching off pollinality. It works quite well. Microimmunotherapy has got a remedy called Allerge, which works reasonably well. It's not brilliant, it's not perfect. Of course, the big pharma has their drugs that switch it off, which I don't like using for obvious reasons.
Yeah, there was also another research report that I read where it said that Wuhan in China was one of the most heavily polluted cities in all of China, and that that was one of the reasons why the coronavirus outbreak there was so severe, and that once everything was shut down and the pollution disappeared, that people stopped having such serious reactions.
Well, that makes perfect sense, and I can well believe that. I'm also told, I don't know if it's right or not, but I'm also told that Wuhan was one of the cities where 5G was first rolled out. So maybe there's a perfect storm there of the viral release from the laboratory, because I don't think anybody's in any doubt now that the virus did come from the viral laboratory in Wuhan, and then the pollution and the 5G eroded people's immune systems, so COVID-19 got a grip and caused disease. What I'm saying is look after the immune system. Don't be polluted. Avoid the 5G. Get the 4 PK diet, vitamin C, vitamin D, iodine in place, and there will be no problem with COVID-19. Remember, this is a virus that's here to stay. It's here forever, and it's going to mutate. It's already mutated into different forms, and what that means is vaccination's never going to catch up with it. So you can forget the vaccine program. It's not going to protect you. You look after your immune system, and you'll be right as rain.
Well, I'm at the end of my questions. I'm absolutely fascinated with your talk, and the content of this has been fabulous. Susan, do you have any?
There's a question on migraines. I know that magnesium helps with that, but the question is, can vitamin C help against the oxidative stress in the early stages of migraine or migraine?
Oh, that's a good question. With migraine, I know there are 2 important players. We know, first of all, allergy. There's no question it's the allergic headache. And, there are any numbers of people who will, have migraine driven by an allergy to it or a vasoactive amine like red wine, tryptophan or whatever. So there's an obvious chemical component there. There's also an energy delivery issue with migraine. And very often people, if their energy suddenly declines for whatever reason, the missed sleep, too much sleep sometimes, oddly, working long hours, that will trigger a migraine. And I think that's where magnesium is critical, because magnesium is probably, well, I don't say the most important, because you can't have the most important, but magnesium is actually absolutely central to mitochondrial function. And in fact, there used to be a clinic in New York that Leo Gallen told me about, and this was in about 1990, where anybody in New York could walk into this clinic with a migraine, receive intravenous magnesium, and walk out of it headache-free. And there have been a few occasions when I've been able to confirm that in my own practice. Somebody's come to see me, and for whatever reason, they've got a migraine. If I give them an intravenous bolus of magnesium, it abolishes the headaches, in seconds. So there is, definitely an energy delivery component here. But I'm not aware of any studies where vitamin C has been used to treat an acute migraine. But it's a reasonable hypothesis, and of course, when I treat my patients, they're all doing all the regimes, and so there are often multiple reasons why their headaches can melt away and do. And sometimes I'm not sure. Well, is it because I've taken the food out of their diet, or is it because we've improved their mitochondrial function? Or bottom line is the migraine's gone, and that's all that really matters. But you're quite right. It's reasonable to suppose that vitamin C may well have a role to play, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah. Some people say that there's long-term effects from the COVID virus or brain effects. So somebody's asking, what's a long-term impact of COVID, especially for people with chronic illnesses such as chronic fatigue?
Well, it's going to switch on inflammation wherever it ends up in the body. And in the brain, you're going to get brain inflammation, and that can drive a whole host of nasty brain pathologies. So, we don't really know, but basically they're going to present with ME. They're going to present with the post-viral chronic fatigue syndrome. And all these interventions we've talked about today are going to be central for recovery. So any patient with, you know, a post-viral, a post-COVID-19 ME, I'd say put in place groundhog chronic. And because of the lipid coat virus, you know, Stevens BHT might be a very helpful intervention. But, you know, at this, you know, so it's difficult, you know, people are looking for simple answers to complex questions and they're just not there. We have to do the whole thing. We have to build the whole house, as I call it, from scratch to give people the best chance of recovering.
Yeah, I'm not a clinician, but I've never met somebody with a migraine problem that didn't also have an intractable thyroid problem.
Voila. And of course, you know, the thyroid is centrally important to energy delivery mechanisms and centrally important to inflammation mechanisms.
Yep,
So,
definitely.
you know,
Overlap.
I'd second that.
Well, one person had a question about, I think the answers are going to come down to the same about, you know, how to keep the brain healthy. And I'm sure that the PK diet's going to be a part of that. And then there's probably people questioning how to support the mitochondria. And I suspect that whatever the question is, the answer is going to, you know, be in what you're telling us already.
Absolutely. I mean, if you want the specific package of supplements, you know, I produced another book, you know, diagnosis of chronic fatigue and ME, and my patients love the subtitle, which is "It's mitochondria, not hypochondria." But in there are details of the regimes I use to improve mitochondrial function. Of course, guess what? It's the fuel in the tank. They love to run on ketones. The raw materials: magnesium, CoQ10, D-ribose, L-carnitine, vitamin B3, all vital. Detoxing, and then what controls mitochondria is the thyroid gland and the adrenal gland. And thyroid hormones, in fact, the impact of thyroid hormones on mitochondria is really interesting. It's a two-fold impact. First of all, thyroid hormones determine how fast your mitochondria go. So you could have perfect fuel, perfect mitochondria, but if your thyroid gland's only set at 5 miles an hour, you're only going to get 5 miles an hour. So they determine how fast the mitochondria go. But they also determine how many mitochondria you've got. So if you've been underactive with the thyroid for a long time, you're not going to have as many mitochondria as you should, i.e. the engine of your car is rather small. As you increase the dose of thyroid and you give it a chance to work, mitochondria replicate themselves, i.e. you end up with a bigger engine. And guess what? That's totally desirable. You know, I don't want to be driving around my life in a De Chauvet with a 500cc engine. I want a Rolls Royce with, you know, 3 litre that can really go places. And, you know, and I want that for my patients too. So the point about thyroid is there's a 2-phase response to it. There's an instant hit as the mitochondria go faster as you gradually increase the dose. But there's also a delayed effect. With time, as you increase the number of mitochondria, your engine becomes more powerful. So be patient with thyroid hormones. Always start with very modest doses, increase very gently, because you have to increase the dose in parallel with mitochondrial function, because the mitochondria are useless and you take a big dose of thyroid, it's like flogging a dead horse, isn't it? You know, you're saying, go faster, and the mitochondria aren't in a fit state, or maybe they're not fit numbers of them to be able to respond. So thank you for bringing that up. It emphasizes the point to be very gentle with the thyroid and the adrenal treatment. Go slow.
How about pediatric applications of your model? Do you do the same 4 pillars with children?
Of course, it's exactly the same. In fact, with children, it's even more important to do these regimes to the letter, because not only are they living, but they are growing and developing, and the immune system is being trained and the brain is being trained. In fact, as we speak, I'm in the throes of writing another book called Green Mother, which I'm writing in parallel with a very dear friend of mine, Michelle, who's just disappearing down the track as I speak. She came to stay in my area about 4 years ago. She became pregnant, and during this time she's had 2 babies, both fully breastfed. Now Michelle took these ideas on board from the beginning. So throughout pregnancy, breastfeeding, weaning, second pregnancy, breastfeeding, weaning, she has done a paleo ketogenic diet and vitamin C and supplements. Both her daughters breastfed, paleo ketogenic, weaned, paleo ketogenic. Now what's the result of that? Firstly, those babies run on ketones, and since 3 months of age, both of them sleep 13 hours every night to the clock. Bob's asks to go to bed at 7 o'clock, puts her head down, and she doesn't stir until 8 o'clock the next morning when Michelle has to go and wake her up. Why? She's running on fat. She doesn't get hungry in the night. She doesn't need feeding in the night. She's got lots of subcutaneous fat, so she can power her body and she can power her brain throughout the night. Second point is they're not consuming any sugar. Their gut has been inoculated with Michelle's very normal microbiome. So those babies have never burped, posited, or vomited in their life, because there's nothing to ferment. Then there's their gut has been correctly inoculated, and they're on a very low carbohydrate diet. And the other fascinating thing that I learned, because the joy of writing books is you have to research. And I did some research to discover that the baby's brain between 0, i.e. birth, and 3 months grows at the rate of 1% every day. Now I have to say that just blew me away. That sort of rate of growth is phenomenal. And guess what? The brain is 70% fat. It needs lots of fat, essential fatty acids, saturated fats to develop normally. And guess what? Those 2 little babies, they are as sharp as a tack. And guess what? They're not immunized, so their immune system is going to be correctly educated by, yes, let's hope they do get measles. Let's hope they do get German measles and mumps as young children when the immune system is well able to deal with those infections. You may have heard of the work of Thomas Cowan, who's a pediatrician in Canada, who's demonstrated that proper childhood febrile illnesses, proper measles, proper mumps, proper chickenpox, protect you from cancer later on in life, because it trains the immune system to recognize those viruses and deal with them for life. And many of those viruses are carcinogenic. If you don't deal with those viruses efficiently and well early on in life, and you get them later on in life, then they can drive nasty tumors, brain cancers, lymphomas, and leukemias. So another reason not to vaccinate. For the immune system, it's disastrous programming. Let the kids, feed them well, nourish them well, and they will deal with infections perfectly well, no problems at all.
Well, I certainly would say from me and from the viewers here, thank you very much for this presentation. It's inspiring, and also I probably should thank you for all the people who will watch this after it's posted.
My pleasure.
Susan, you have
Yes, thank you very much. As a street cleaner is going by and cleaning the streets, making lots of noise. You're fantastic. You're great.
Very kind. Thank you, Susan. You're very kind. And thank you, Stephen. You're asking all the right questions. That makes it very easy for me to rabbit on.
excellent. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye for now, guys.
Thank you.